I'd like to start this off. How many people here have ever read Voicebot.AI? Oh, you are my crowd. I love this. You know, I used to ask that question and like 2 hands would go up. So this is very gratifying. I do want to do something here, and I appreciate if you'd play along because I think it will reveal something to the people in the room. If you could stand up, please, if you've ever used a voice assistant in a car. Any type of voice. Okay. Stay standing, so that means the rest of you sit down, if you used one before 2014, which was like more than 5 years ago. Okay. How about before 2010? And I know there's going to be, one person's going to be. How about before 2005? Okay, Frank Raines, no, stay standing. What year do you think you was the first time you used it, and what was the car? Late 90s, okay. Ron? Ah. Yeah, well, that's not what I asked, but that's interesting. So what year do you think that was? 2002. Okay, great. How many people know what this is? Jaguar? Whoa, who said that? All right, there you go. Jaguar S-Type. This is the 2001. So if the people in back could actually click this and play the video. Oop, nope, you want to go back. There you go. That's okay. You can just start the video. It's fine. We'll get back to the right slide. We need audio. I'll stand in the middle.
In the glove box. Really? What's this? Climate control. Temperature. 24 degrees. Thank you very much, Trevor. Actually, quite a lot of the stuff in here is voice activated.
Okay, you can stop that. Thanks. In the back, you can stop this. We can go to the next video. Okay, perfect. All right, so 2001, that's the first one that I could find. That was a Dragon Systems project with Jaguar. That was the first one that I could find that was actually embedded in the car. So now this next one, I don't know. How many people know what this is from, this next picture? Anybody? Super Bowl ad? Okay, you guys can stop that in the back. Okay, so that was a Super Bowl commercial, and the car didn't show up for 44 seconds, right? And when it did show up, they didn't talk about performance, anything that we would normally see. They started with voice. I think you guys have one of those YouTube videos playing in the background. There you go. You can stop that. And when they did, they focused exclusively on the voice feature. Okay, so I want to play another one. And I'm not just playing to the crowd because there's Mercedes people here. But so if you guys could tee up the next video. Oops. That's good.
Fix it up a little.
Hey, city. How about a car can park in the street? I was looking for a guy who doesn't want to go to office.
Another one's a good looking.
Hey, Mercedes.
Not everyone went to law school.
You're right with touchscreen, right? Hello?
Hey, Mercedes. I don't even have the time. You're getting mahogany dashboard.
Hey, Mercedes, can you make it a little cooler in here? I'm setting the temperature to 68 degrees. Hey, Mercedes, is Thai kitchen open?
We hear you.
Okay, you can stop that one now in the back. So again, another 45 seconds before we saw our car, almost 50 seconds. And wow, that's a really great way to introduce a new feature. Oh, the consumer recognition that there's a voice feature in the car is very low. Oh, I can fix that. I can run 45 seconds of a commercial and just say, hey, Mercedes, over and over and over again. And I can do it in the context of two things. One is showing people the different features, but also to bring it to the front of their mind that voice is a thing in the car that you can use. Okay, so we have one more in here. There we go. I think you need the other video. This is the last video we just played. Sorry. So to the right, yeah. Okay, so you can stop that. I don't know if everybody heard that. So that's, and you can go back to the presentation. Okay, so I play this one. It's Alexa's only mentioned in the first 7 seconds or so of that. But again, what we're talking about here is two things. One is they're showing that Alexa is available in the new Toyota RAV4, but they're also showing that you can do some things outside the car that are, or normally you think of as things you do from outside the car, like things that you would ask of a search engine or something like that, to find something different to do, right? This is very different than saying, change the climate control or roll up the windows, right? These are things that aren't necessarily associated with the car, but are part of the driving experience. And so I wanted to point some of these things out because we have major car brands, and there's many others, we could spend the whole time showing some of these, who are now putting voice first in the marketing of the cars. It is a key feature, and I think we're going to hear a lot about that. But that is a change, and that's a significant change that's come about really in the last 6 months or so. And that is going to change the way consumers think about the driving experience. All right, so let's see here. Can we go back to the presentation? There we go. So the question is, why are auto brands doing this? And for those of you who've read Voicebot, we like numbers, so I put a few numbers up here, which I think explains what's going on here from the perspective of auto brands. So the first is 45. So 45% of US adults have used a smart speaker, have used a voice assistant in the car. Right? And that number is higher than smart speakers. So only 26% have used a smart speaker. So we think about smart speakers a lot as sort of driving this discussion around voice, and yet more people have tried it in the car. And then we have this number 77, and 77 million US adults say they are using voice in the car at least on a monthly basis. You know, again, that's higher than the 49 million who are using smart speakers on a monthly basis, a little bit less than on the phone. But still, it's an area that really in some ways has been underexploited in terms of the ability to provide a new value to a consumer as well as to drive some additional engagement in a place where you normally can't reach consumers very well. 60%, very interesting. So this is very similar to some data that's going to come out. Ariane's and Alexa Auto people are going to talk about this later. Very similar to data that they saw in terms of about 3 in 5 consumers now say that the voice assistant in the car now influences the car decision. Okay, so broadly, and these are things like it's a minor consideration, it's significant, but we have 19% that say it's very significant or it's a requirement that the car have the voice assistant that that consumer wants, right? And so I go back to Mercedes, and with Mercedes, they might want to have people desire the Hey Mercedes capability, and they need to drive that up. But at the same time, they might also want to enable consumers to use Siri or Alexa or Google Assistant in the car because that's what they prefer. Because what's more important to car makers than anything else? Selling more cars, right? And they don't want anybody to say, hey, you don't have my voice assistant, so I'm going to walk across to the dealership across the street where they do, and that's the car I'm going to buy. It's too big of a purchase, and it's too infrequent of a purchase for them to just throw this out to chance that someone will say, oh, I'll change my preference. And 36%, another interesting thing, say that of the people who use voice daily in the car, right? So the sort of the power users of voice today in the car, they say 36%, more than 1 in 3, that actually is driving their purchase decision. And there's a couple other things I thought was kind of interesting. If you look at it, the income group that skews more use of voice tends to be upper income. So again, a lot of auto brands care about that. And then it skews millennial. So Fred Jacobs is in the front row. Was there a concern a couple years ago that millennials will never buy cars? Absolutely, right?
They never listen to radio.
That's right. They won't buy cars, they won't buy homes, and yet millennials are using voice assistants at a very high rate. If you want millennials to buy your cars, hey, not a bad idea to promote your voice assistant. Okay, so then the question is, what are people doing in the car? So the first thing I want to point out is Lisa Falkson works for Amazon now, a friend of mine. She was working for the car company, self-driving car company NIO, some of you may have heard of, and she was designing their whole voice interactive experience. And what she told me on our podcast interview about almost 2 years ago, actually almost exactly 2 years ago today, was that there are 3 basic things that people want to do in the car. They want to talk, they want to go, and they want to play, okay? And so what we found in our survey data was that 74% of the people who'd used a voice assistant in the car had used it to make a call. That was by far the highest use case they'd used. Second, 50%, only 50% had used voice for navigation. That was kind of surprising to me, but there's other options for that, obviously. And then 29% had accessed some sort of music service. All right? Now, if we keep in that same vein in terms of the talk, go, play, we see that of the top 6, there's 3 more that fall nicely in those same categories. So 41% had used voice to send a text message. I mean, I think back to 2011 in Siri. Not surprising, that was one of the first things that they really promoted. 18% had used voice to navigate to a restaurant, and 8% had used it to access the radio. Okay, so a couple things I want to point out here. We have sort of these big 3 up through 30%, 74 to 30%, but we also have this texting over here, which is really high, right? It's 41. And these are sort of the big 3. There's this communication and navigation. That's what consumers say they're doing today. That's the behavior that's learned. And then if we look at some of these other things around entertainment and around navigation to, or learning more about places you could go, that's a behavior that needs to be learned by consumers. They need to be educated about that. Okay? In fact, we have a number of other use cases in the report, and they're all in low single digits. And what that shows us is there's really a concentration of the use cases in automotive. People aren't really doing that much, but that actually may be changing soon. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who haven't seen this data, it's all available in a free report. Go to voicebot.ai/research. And you'll see at the in-car voice assistant consumer adoption report, Score Publishing, Bradley, and Nico Vore from Drive Time are actually the co-sponsors of that. So that's available for you guys to look at. All this data is in there. So the next thing we want to look at is say, okay, if we have these very limited use cases in the car, let's look at the way the use cases of voice differ when we're looking at other surfaces. So in the smart speaker and smartphone, you see that the top use case is actually asking a general question. Think of that as sort of voice search or voice query. It doesn't even show up. Like nobody in the car even thinks that that's a thing to do, right? And yet, I think we've all been driving along and had a question at some point, right? That we might be able to get a quick answer to if we were able to answer it. So there's some education that needs to be done there. Now, when we look at entertainment, particularly streaming music services, it's number 2 on the smart speaker and number 4 in the car. So there is starting to be a little alignment there. But for the most part, then, if you look at smart speakers, totally different from these other 2 surfaces. And then when we see is the car and the smartphone have 4 of the top 5 use cases in common. So there's a lot of similarities between the 2. And I'll tell you there's a key point here to keep in mind. The car and the phone, people are looking at the same way. They're only using a limited number of use cases. And yet the car, in some ways, is a lot more like the smart speaker on wheels. And so there's a significant opportunity to draw people into more use cases that are more similar to what we're doing in the home with smart speakers, okay? And smart speakers are actually interesting because we see time and time again that they're these training grounds for using voice and other surfaces. And what we're seeing is if you look at daily active users of voice, daily active users of voice in the car, owners of smart speakers are about 40% more likely to be a daily active user than those that are not. So there is some of these overlap there, and if you have that, you're more likely to be a heavier user, and a lot of it is thinking about how you can expand the use cases. Now, expanding the use cases is important to auto brands because they want to provide more value to consumers, but it's also important to like brands and media companies that want to reach consumers while they're on the go. And so you start thinking about these ideas that if you are a brand or media company and you want to think about exploiting or getting access to those consumers while they're on the go, you might have to think about education, that this is an option, as well as just providing the service. All right, so the other thing I want to talk about in terms of these surfaces is a lot of people think of Siri first. I know Ron doesn't. He thinks of Dragon Systems and Dragon Naturally Speaking first, but a lot of people really have that orientation. Then they're like, okay, well, Siri came along, then we had smartphones, we had Alexa, right, in the home, and then Google Home. And then now we have the car, but that's incorrect chronologically because I just showed you a video of voice being demonstrated in the car in 2001. Now Ron says he had it on his phone earlier than that, but you know, we'll let him talk about that another time. But in general, this is the way it went. But what we're seeing is from a use case standpoint and consumer expectations is there's been such rapid adoption of smart speakers in the home that those use cases they're using in the home are then prompting users to start to think about, oh, I could be using voice when I'm on the go as well. Why can't I use it? And then that's introducing them to these other surfaces. And the other thing that it's done is you think about the traditional view of voice in automotive. It is cabin control, navigation, entertainment, the things that are purely in context for the car. But what's really starting to happen now is we're bringing all these other things from outside the car in. Now, the Mercedes ad that we saw from the Super Bowl, it talked about all these climate controls, these internal controls. So, and I pulled the entertainment, I changed the color of the lights and those types of things. That's very traditional view of what a voice can do in the car. But then we saw the example with Toyota where they were saying, Alexa, let's spice this up, or they request like a restaurant that's a little bit different. So that's like considered like an outside the car experience, but they're using the voice while they're driving in order to pull that in. And so that's why one of the things to start thinking about is if you have an application or use case, is it an inside the car experience or is it an outside the car experience that you're trying to bring in, and what's the context associated with that? Okay, so we talked about why auto brands are doing it. We talked about what consumers are doing. Let's talk about how automakers are actually implementing voice in the car and how users are accessing it. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the pure usage model from consumers. So what we found in the study that I just referenced a moment ago is that on a relative basis, smartphone through Bluetooth connection to their smartphone and in the dash are the two most common. They're both at about 32%. So think about it, about a third of the people are predominantly accessing it through Bluetooth, about a third are predominantly accessing the native voice assistant provided by the auto manufacturer. And then after that, we have a couple things, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, which are essentially emulation technologies. So we're taking the smartphone experience and we're emulating a portion of that into the car. And then after that, we've got some of these other voice assistants that people have. We've got Amazon Auto, which is still continuing to roll out. But if we think about it, the experiences in the car basically come in 4 flavors. We've got the smartphone connection to Bluetooth, which I know that a lot of people in this room have definitely used. We've got dashboard integration. For those of you that have a voice assistant that's shipped with the car, then you've probably at least tried it out. We've got the smartphone emulation, and this has been a long time in coming because Apple CarPlay and Android Auto have been around for a number of years. They're now in hundreds of car models, but it took several years to get there. And even when they rolled out, the experiences were limited, and you see them starting to add more capabilities. But this is a thing to say, hey, my context, my comfort level with interacting with apps is mostly on my smartphone. Let's just try to replicate that experience in the car. And then we have these voice interactive devices, which are things like the Rove Viva and the Rove Bolt, the Alexa Auto, which I still don't have one, even though I signed up in September for the beta release. I don't know if there's someone in here who can help with that, please. But interestingly enough, they had a million pre-orders in, I think, the first 4 months that it was available. Maybe faster, I don't know, but they say it's 1 million pre-orders. So people want this. They're saying, hey, you know what? This is okay. Maybe it's not available here. What's my stopgap? So they want Alexa in the car, Alexa Auto, or you can use some of the products by Anchor, and there's a couple others out there. So those are the primary areas. Now, I say all this to say that we should put this in context. A lot of the discussion out there today is really focused on what I call general purpose voice assistants, right? So these are the ones we all know: Alexa, Bixby, Google Assistant, Siri. Now, when we start to think about it, say, okay, well, what are some of the characteristics of those general purpose voice assistants? Well, one is they're platform controlled. So you can only do what the platform allows you to do if everyone's a passenger on their platform, okay? The other thing is, like, how broad is the feature scope? What are they saying that they can do for the consumer? And if you look at the general purpose players, very broad feature scope, okay? Now, if we break this down a little bit, we say, okay, well, there are other things out there, though, right? And so there are some niche players that we talk about, and this is what we call the Gown framework. So, general purpose, own, niche, and then white label. The niche players don't have broad scope, but they only let you do what they let you do. So it's circumscribed in terms of the boundaries of the feature set. The owned solutions, these tend to be very narrow because they are built in-house by a brand or somebody who owns a property. It's their own voice assistant. In fact, it's a sort of the opposite of the general purpose, right? It's what they built it. They may have used open source tools or third-party tools, but for the most part, they assembled it together. They define what it can do. They control the data. They control the experience 100%. And then we have white label, which is essentially kind of like the general purpose, but it is third-party platforms that say, hey, we already have all this stuff built for you. So if you are an auto brand or if you're a bank or something like that, you can just use our stuff and you can have a much broader experience than you would otherwise. You don't have to go to the trouble of building it. And so I point out this for a couple of different reasons. One is, we talked about the general purpose already. And let's go to the niche, because I don't think this gets a lot of attention. Brendan's in here from Ader. So what they do is, it's just for small businesses to connect to their SaaS solutions so they can run their business more efficiently. So again, they control the experience, and it's circumscribed in terms of the breadth, but it's available to just about everybody. Cortana has moved that way. People, heard from Satya Nadella saying he's not going to do consumer anymore. It's going to be for anybody who's using Office 360, Cortana will be there for you. Voicea, Presence, there's a few others in that space. Now let's go down to the owned. So some people are familiar with like Erica for Bank of America or Eno from Capital One. They built their own solution. But we also talk about MBUX from Mercedes. We talk about BMW Connected Drive. So essentially what they've done is they've said, hey, this is really important, or we've already built something very similar to this, and we want to control this end to end. It's not to say they're going to keep some of these other players out, but at least they want to connect end to end. And then we have this other area, which is essentially tool sets and services that you can implement. And this is where SoundHound has had a lot of success recently with the Houndify platform. A number of car manufacturers have implemented that because they're saying, hey, we want something like Alexa, but we want a little bit more control like this, but we don't want to go to the trouble of actually building and maintaining that. And so they're using these third-party white label tools where they can essentially say, this is mine, although it's a common solution in the background. Now, the long-time player in that space is Nuance. And so Nuance has been doing this for decades, and they have really defined the in-car voice assistant experience for much of its life, and they still have a lot of tools. They're actually splitting that business off to Nuance Automotive so they can focus on this more. They've got some really interesting things they're doing in the cabin, but essentially the same thing. And then what's really interesting is say, okay, from an automotive standpoint, a lot of the activity is down here because car makers are saying, I want to control that experience. But because consumers are so interested in using their voice assistants that they're becoming accustomed to in the home, they're starting to put this quadrant in there as well. They're saying you can have both. So that leads to a potential challenge, right? Because I think with Mercedes, you can access 4 different assistants at any given time, different methods. Well, I guess you could only do 3 consistently, but one of them actually goes to 2, and so it's a common voice. But essentially, there's multiple tools that are being integrated here. And then you can just jump over to something potentially like in BMW just to go to Alexa, right? And so if you think about that, there's a couple things to consider. And Michael Levin, a lot of people will know and here are familiar with design, had this concept of continuous, consistent, and complementary solutions. So the idea here is in a multimodal world, you need something that's going to be continuous so that if you start in the home, you can continue it in the car, right? I start listening to my podcast here. I want to get in the car. Why would I have to start that over? I should just be able to pull it back up and continue that experience. Consistent. So this is one of the big challenges, right? So the idea is if you have multiple assistants or you have a different assistant in every part of your life, there's a lot of cognitive load. And so is there a way that you can create some consistency? So there's contextual consistency, like in the car, you might have your specialty solution, or in my office, if I'm a small business, maybe I use something like Aider to help me become more knowledgeable about how my business is operating. But then we also have this idea, is that going to create this break in the way people think about voice, and how many assistants are they going to have to learn? And then there's the idea of complementary. It's we go back again to the car. So you've got the voice interaction, you've got the voice-only experience, but you also have the dashboard, and a lot of really beautiful dashboards and screens are going into these cars now. So then the question is, how does that experience complement the voice experience? Do you allow voice only? Do you allow voice first plus these other capabilities? How do you display information? Do you only display certain types of information? You'd never speak it. So these are things that Michael Levin would talk about, are really important in any type of multimodal design. And I add this one around contextual, and I really give the credit to this to Jan Koenig from Jovo, who's been working a lot in this space and has an open source framework for building across voice assistants. And this idea that we also need to think of the context. And you think of the context in the car or any type of device is there's a primary context, but then there's secondary context, right? Because even in the car, I might be driving to work or I might be driving on vacation, and that might be a different context in terms of how I use my voice assistant. But certainly the context, if you're building for these platforms, the context of where people are, what device they're accessing this through is really critical, right? So what I'm looking for in the car often, as we saw by these use cases, is different from what I'm looking for in the home, or at least the primary use cases need to be covered. So that's what I have right now. I don't know if we've got 5 minutes for questions.
Yes? Okay, so you said a third of the use in the car is smartphone Bluetooth access. What are then people using? Did you divide which assistants they're going to if they come through that channel?
Well, we didn't ask the question quite that way. So you could just assume that it's going to be roughly broken down between Apple and Android based on their market share. But that's essentially it. If you're using Bluetooth, it's going to your smartphone, and you're using then the smartphone's brains and capabilities and the voice assistant there to do all the additional work. And James has a new book out. Yes, sir.
So it seems to me that with speech to text, there's sort of an inflection point that we're kind of approaching where the accuracy gets high enough that people might actually use it, for example. So do you think there's like kind of an inflection point here where, I mean, I've used voice speakers a lot, but in my car, there's a thing, I never talk to my car.
Right.
Because it's just like, it's kind of difficult, it doesn't really do things that I want. I was in my friend's Tesla, I wanted to turn on, I'm driving the car.
Yeah.
It's hard to figure out how to control anything in this car, it's not my car. And, I want to say, turn on the windshield wipers. No, sorry.
Well, Tesla doesn't have any manifested voice strategy, right? They might have great ideas, but they don't have it. So, and I would say, are you a millennial, sir?
No.
So if we go back to the data, we saw that the millennials are actually using this most often. And part of that, I think, is they don't have the overhang, right? So some of us have a little bit of baggage in terms of the voice assistants we used in cars. We're really terrible. Now, if you look back at the David Hammond's demonstration of the Jaguar S-Type, it was more of a novelty, right? If you said things just the right way, it would do things for you. And that's essentially how it was for a decade, maybe more, maybe 15 years. And I think there's a lot of people who are saying, hey, I need to start thinking about this again, because one of the things that I didn't show here is that about 2/3 of the consumers said they think voice assistants used in cars are much better than they were 2 years ago. So they're starting to recognize this, and I think some of these habits people are starting to have on their smartphones and in the home are carrying over to the car. That was a great question. Yes, sir.
What are the chances, to me, with the adoption of Amazon and Google, it seems to me it would just be much easier for these car makers to just work with them to build out the framework internally so that there is no friction for the consumer from home to car. Do you see that happening, or do you think this multiple strategy is good for the consumer? Because I don't see it personally, but...
Well, there's at least 5 separate times today you'll be able to ask that same question, and you'll be able... I'm sorry. So the question was, if I paraphrase correctly, you tell me if I got this right, is that Amazon, Google, they already have really robust assistants. Why don't the automakers just employ that and forget about doing their own thing, right? And I see some people nodding in the back row. And my point is, yes, you could ask that to a lot of people. If there's 10 people on stage, you'll probably get 12 opinions. I'll say that it's not that simple because, first of all, the automakers, and I won't speak for them, but I can look at their behavior. They want to control that experience. They want to have it unique, and they want to make sure it always works. And they want to control the data. They want to be able to see the data. And so that's one of the key drivers of why they're doing it. And they're saying, okay, I will bring some of these things from outside the car that people already like, but I'm going to do that with this one caveat that I'm going to have this general experience that I'm offering, because I don't sell 4 wheels and a motor. I sell an experience on the road that gets you from here to there. And voice is becoming an increasingly important part of that experience, and I want to be able to control that. And they're going to bring it in. So we might see some cars that'll just go, straight to Alexa, for example, and that'll do everything. But what we're seeing is actually the momentum is behind using Houndify and Nuance or building their own, end-to-end. And I think that's really goes down to this idea that they want control and differentiation.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
So I don't know that you asked this question
Okay.
in the survey, so I'm probably asking it on a bit of a limb, but somewhat related to that question. Do you perceive any customer loyalty to particular assistants? So if I buy a Honda and it's got Alexa, I'm invested in Alexa. And that Toyota looks really great, but it's using Google.
Okay, yeah. So to paraphrase the question, are we seeing any loyalty to assistants, and that's driving them to select or choose bias towards a certain auto brand? So I would say that two things. One, first and foremost, yes, in our study, that does come up, and that was some of that data that we showed. Around 60% think it's important, 20% think it's very important that it have the assistant that they're accustomed to. And there's some news coming out in 15 minutes from Amazon that will indicate that they found similar things, and in fact, a very significant number of consumers are saying that they will bias towards selecting an auto brand that has the voice assistant that they like to use in the home. So that's a great question. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much. Have a great day. It's been a great lineup of speakers.